Welcome back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from St. Augustine. Augustine, some people pronounce his name Augustine. I might go back and forth between the two pronunciations. I've never heard a good argument as to which pronunciation is better, so maybe we'll just say St. Augustine. This particular philosopher lived in the early or mid 300s to the early 400s AD. So we've shifted now from Aristotle, who lived a couple hundred years before the time of Christ, to St. Augustine, who lives a few hundred years after the time of Christ. So we've kind of shifted from what's called ancient philosophy to what is now often called the philosophy of the Middle Ages or medieval philosophy. Now, that term medieval is a little misleading because the word literally means between the ages. Medi, like mid, aval, like evil, like ages. So the philosophy of the Middle Ages is a bit of a misnomer. It's philosophers kind of look at the history of Western philosophy, at least, and look at ancient philosophy, and then look at modern philosophy, and then that period between the two they call the philosophy of the Middle Ages. So, I mean, there's nothing really wrong with the term Middle Ages, but it's kind of like a little bit pejorative, I think, because it's assuming that the ancient philosophy, that's really important, and then modern philosophy, what's going on today, or say in the last 400 or 500 years, that's important. And there's this stuff in between. We'll just call that the Middle Ages. Even worse, some people call it the Dark Ages. Now, there's nothing really dark about the Middle Ages. This period that runs between, say, the 3rd century AD and roughly, say, 1500 or 1400. There's nothing really dark in that 1,000-year period. In fact, the way that I like to think about the history of Western philosophy is that there's Christian philosophy, which begins because of Jesus. And then before that is pre-Christian philosophy. And after that is post-Christian philosophy, of which we are still in that age. Now, that doesn't mean that Christian philosophy is not still going on in our contemporary time. What it is to say is rather that, at least in our institutions, in the time we live in now, there's a large rejection of the Christian faith. Now, this was not the case for St. Augustine. In fact, in this 3rd or 4th century after the time of Christ, Christian philosophy and Christian intellectual life begins to really flourish. It starts with the New Testament, the Gospel writers, and then expands on to the Church Fathers, and many of whom were martyred for their faith, and begins to kind of really flower at the time of St. Augustine, and then builds on into the 500s, 600s, with a philosopher named Boethius, who you'll hear a little bit about in this discussion as well. And then there's a bit of a gap until about the 800s, 900s, in the period sometimes called the Carolingian Renaissance. This is from the Frankish, French, and German kind of mixed emperor named Charlemagne. And there was a flowering of philosophy. One of the main philosophers during that period is a philosopher named Duns Scotus Eriugena. John Duns Scotus Eriugena. And he also continues this rich tradition of Christian philosophy. And then with the rise of Islam in the 7th century, you also have an attempt by Islamic scholars and theologians to integrate philosophical thought into Islamic theology, along with Jewish theology, during this period. And then there's going to be the next lecture is going to be on a philosopher named Thomas Aquinas, and we're going to jump about 1,000 years, maybe 900 years into the future, after we cover Augustine. But know that this period from the time of Christ till about 1400, maybe the time of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, is a time of great expansive work in philosophy and in theology, along with many other areas of human life. And if you're interested, I can recommend, maybe I'll post some books that I can refer to here in this discussion. In fact, let me just pull this up. I'll pause the video for a moment and let me pull up a couple books that I use in my history of Western philosophy that you might find interesting on this period. Okay, so what you're seeing on the screen now is my syllabus from a course that I teach on the history of Western philosophy. It's a course we offer in our philosophy program here at CBU, but I just wanted to recommend a couple of books to you here that are listed in my syllabus. If you want a copy of these, just send me a note and I can email them to you. But let me just mention a couple in particular. This book called The Making of Europe is quite good by Christopher Dawson. This book by C.S. Lewis called The Discarded Image. This book here, two books called How the West Won and The Victory of Reason by a sociologist named Rodney Stark, and then a book by Barbara Tuchman called The Distant Mirror. These four books, three or four, I guess, five maybe, books will really help you if you want to do additional reading on the history of Western philosophy, especially the philosophy that occurs in what philosophers call the Middle Ages, what I call the era of Christian philosophy. These books will really be helpful. I found them helpful for myself, and if you want some additional reading on this topic, this is a really nice place to begin that. So I commend them to you. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program and our discussion of Saint Augustine. So Saint Augustine was born in the Roman Empire after it had been Christianized. The majority of the persecutions had all been stopped within about 100-year time period that Augustine began his writing in his adult life. The Emperor Constantine was the first Christian emperor, and he died just soon before Augustine's life, not too long before, and had allowed Christianity to become legal in the Roman Empire. And then he also moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to what's now called Istanbul, but has been called and still called by the Greeks today in Greece, Constantinople. And so Christendom was kind of in this transition period from being a religious tradition that had been persecuted and yet was still flourishing and growing rapidly and had grown rapidly in the 300 years before Augustine's birth, since the time of Christ, but now had become transitioned into having Christianity legalized and recognized as, and eventually going to become the official religion within the empire. So it's a very interesting transitional period, and Augustine plays a pivotal role in that transition. So let's take a look at some of these ideas from Augustine, and make sure that we are working through some of his ideas and his biography. Just a couple things here about Augustine. He wrote a book called The Confessions. I have it here on my shelf, just so you can. This is a well-worn copy of The Confessions. It's kind of an interesting book. It's not very long. There are some very difficult parts in philosophy in it towards the end, but the bulk of it is kind of reflections. It's a unique, almost a sui generis genre, that it's kind of one of a kind type of work. It's part biography, part philosophy, part theology, part poetry. It's a beautiful work, and if you take the time to read it, I think you'll be greatly rewarded. Or you can just join my History of Western Philosophy class. It's offered every spring, and we work, every fall, and we work through the Confessions each semester. So Augustine was born in North Africa, which is an area called Thagaste, which is now Algeria. His father was a pagan, his name was Patricius. By pagan, I don't mean that pejoratively. It just means he worshipped the traditional Roman deities. His mother, named Monica, was a devout Christian and played an incredible influence in his life through prayer, through her own suffering, and it's a beautiful story of love, maternal love, and commitment to seeing her son brought into the faith. At age 18, he left Christianity, and before returning, he explored a couple different kind of options or alternatives to Christianity. One is called Manichaeism, which is was at the time a worldwide religion stretched from Central Asia all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in the West. It's gone today, and it was gone soon after the time of Augustine. It was a very esoteric religion, kind of a dualistic religion, focused on light and dark, but also materialistic, which is kind of strange. So, and it blended, it was syncretistic. It blended stuff from Judaism and Christianity and Zoroastrianism, amongst other pagan religions as well. Very mystic oriented, and well, Augustine wasn't having it. He also explored astrology, and and then he became a skeptic, kind of always questioning knowledge. And then he kind of shifted over to Neoplatonism. But each of these, Manichaeanism, he just thought the views on this were nutty. There were strict dietary requirements as well as celibacy, which Augustine wasn't particularly interested in when he was a young man. He left astrology. I mean, he writes in the Confessions as well as elsewhere in the City of God, which is a 1,000-page, very long book, which Augustine, I'm working my way through it slowly. But he recognized that astrology is supposed to determine your fate, like where the stars are when you're born. But twins who are born on the same stars don't have the same life. And so he kind of just commonsensically looked at that and said, I can't follow this. Then with skepticism, even though he thought maybe he should question everything, one thing that he couldn't question was the absolute certainty that he had about the way the external world appears to us. Right? I might question that what appears to me is real, right? But I can't question the fact that I am being appeared to by an outside world, and therefore my believing that there is an outside world. Right? You can doubt what occurs to you, but you can't doubt that it's occurring to you, and that's the beliefs that are formed through. So he rejected skepticism, and lastly, he rejected Neoplatonism. Plato, we've talked a little bit about in this course, and you're doing some reading on him. But with Plato, um, there's a lot of things that Plato got right, even according to Augustine. I happen to agree with that as well. And Augustine recognized what Plato got right, but he thought there was something more. He thought that, especially with the change in his own heart, he didn't think that Plato could offer that type of renewal and change that only Christ can offer. So he saw Platonism as well as Neoplatonism. This is kind of Platonic thought that arises in the couple centuries after the time of Christ. He saw it as a preparation, Platonism as a preparation for Christianity. So let's take a look now at some of Augustine's conversion account. So in the summer of 386, this is Augustine is fully grown. He'd been teaching. He had moved from North Africa to Rome and then to Milan. And he was with some friends, and he was walking through a garden. But he was having he was in a villa. And he was outside, and he'd been under a kind of spiritual crisis. And he saw the book of Romans in the Bible. He had some Christian friends, so he's familiar with Scripture. He saw a copy of Romans under a tree. And then he heard children playing, like in the next door home or outside on the street, chanting, Tolle lege, which is a strange thing to hear. And it means take up and read. Now, was that children, real children, chanting, or was it God providing a voice? Was it angels calling to him? We don't really know, but we know that Augustine heard this voice saying, take up and read. So he did. He concluded that this was not children. No children's game he'd ever heard it. Had children chant this. So he picks up Romans and reads where it opens. And here's where it opens. It's from Romans chapter 13. Not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual excess and lust, not in quarreling and jealousy. Rather, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the desires of the flesh. Now, Augustine had lived a life up to this point that was exactly the kind of life that the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church at Rome, had told Christians to avoid. A life of physical pleasure, a life of sexual excess and lust, and a life of ambition and trying to get ahead and trying to grasp all the material prestige and offices that he could get. Augustine was pursuing those worldly things, and now God had called him to something higher, to something better. So Augustine and his son was from a woman that he had had, it was his mistress, with whom he wasn't married, and whom he had sent away because he was planning on marrying someone else. Kind of a really Augustine's life in this area was really quite complicated, to say the least. And so his mistress, he never returned to his mistress after his faith, and he never got married. He called off the wedding with this other woman that he was planning to marry, and he and his son were baptized in the year 387. And then Augustine became a priest and returned to Africa in 391. And then he was made a bishop of the town in North Africa called Hippo. But he didn't want it. He just kind of wanted to be a priest and a monk and write and think and maybe teach a little bit. But God had called him to other things, and God had used his superiors within the church to put him in charge of an entire city and the Christian community there, which he did. He was a faithful pastor and leader. A bishop is someone who's overseer of other priests at the time. Now, again, this is there was only one united church in the Roman Empire. Unlike today in post-Reformation Christianity here in America, there were many denominations and different churches had their different organizational structures. But in the 5th century, when Augustine was bishop in the 400s, there was just a hierarchy of churches, and a bishop would oversee a particular city or region or area. And he did that until his death in 430. And when he died, it was also a time of turmoil. There was a group of Christians who were not part of the church at the time. They were considered heretics. There was a heresy called Arianism, not the Arian like the supremacist. It's not that kind of Arian. Named after a priest named Arius, who rejected the Orthodox biblical view of Jesus's nature. And these Christians kind of got wrapped up in Arius's beliefs, and then formed their own churches and also formed their own armies and communities and political structures. And these they were Visigothic, Gothic, Germanic peoples who invaded Spain and then migrated and invaded into North Africa and then swept east to where Hippo was, and they took over Hippo soon after Augustine's death. In fact, they had attacked the city while he was dying. So it's kind of a sad story. Again, that Visigothic kingdom didn't last long, and especially faded away after the rise of Islam. Okay, so let's turn now a little bit. That was a little bit of Augustine's background. Let's take a look now at some of Augustine's philosophical beliefs. It says particularly his epistemology and metaphysics. So Augustine kind of follows Plato in the idea of the forms. He maintains that forms are abstract ideas, absolute ideas, say the form of circularity, the form of what it means to be human, all these formal realities. They don't exist apart from God. In fact, they're contained within the mind of God. Unlike Plato, who thought they existed in their kind of own realm, for Augustine, they existed as things that existed within an entity, in particular, God. Goodness, right, has to be contained within an agent who can act. What is true has to exist in a thing that is true. What is beautiful has to exist in a thing that is beautiful. And so all of these things, goodness, truth, and beauty, exist in God and in his mind, and ultimately in his nature. So our ability is an ability to compare predicates of absolutes, that is qualities of absolutes, like goodness, truth, and beauty. For example, this is his epistemology now. So think of the idea of absolute straightness, right? That is a straight line. It's just like, I don't have a ruler or anything here to show you, but you can picture like an absolutely straight line. Here's maybe one of our books for the class. they can do the best job, right? So think of this line here as the straight line, like the absolute idea of straightness. Of course, it's not absolutely straight; it's got edges and that. But now compare them with the lines on the screen. So think of this as absolute. Sorry, I'll put it up here in my mind. I'm not pretending to be God here, but right. So this is absolute straightness. It's in my mind or in God's mind. And then ask yourself, compared to that absolute straightness, which of these lines are straighter? And of course, you can pretty obviously see this one is straighter than this one, than this one, than this one, right? There's a gradation of straightness. So the idea is that we can only tell which line is straighter because there's an absolute idea of straight. Now, again, this is following Plato, the idea of absolute reality in the formal sense, but for Augustine, it's in the mind of God. And so the same would apply to beauty and truth and goodness. So the idea is that if we misjudge something's perfection, that means we lack knowledge, not that there's no absolute, right? So going back to these lines, if I pick this or this one as straight, right, it doesn't mean that there's no absolute straight notion of straightness. It just means I lack the knowledge of it, right? It doesn't follow that there's no absolute. So these things exist in God's mind, and we're made in His image, according to the Scriptures. So we have some understanding for them. Now, Plato thought that we had forgotten these things, right? And so, of course, Socrates, the philosopher, like a midwife, draws them out of us. But for Augustine, as a Christian, he recognized that our minds are darkened due to what theologians call original sin. That means there's something wrong with us in our very being as humans. That is, we have a sinful, broken intellect, reason. Our will is subservient to our bodily passions. Um, and we are imperfect and we change for the worse. So, what that means is God has to illuminate our minds to be able to see the absolute and objective notions of goodness, truth, and beauty that are in His mind. So, this notion of illumination is really important for Augustine. The idea is that our mind, human beings' minds, are imperfect. Therefore, it changes. And we don't always grasp what is good and true and beautiful. In fact, oftentimes we can't. However, God is perfect and therefore unchanging. And since the imperfect can't perceive the perfect because it transcends imperfection, right? We can't grasp God's mind. We're not God, right? So yet we still need knowledge. So how does this work then? So the only way the imperfect, like our imperfect minds, can think about what is perfect is if the perfect God illuminates the imperfect in our minds. God, in other words, God needs to shine light into our minds so that we can grasp those things that are good and true and beautiful. So, in the same way, now this is a very Platonic notion. Think back to the allegory of the cave. In the same way that the sun allows us to see in the daytime, God illuminates His truth, allowing us to think and dwell on it. Thinking on the truth, for Augustine, brings happiness, right? So the metaphysics is that all truth and reality, goodness, beauty, exists in God's mind and in His nature. He creates us, external from Him. We rebel, right? We're fallen. We are broken. We reject God. Our minds are messed up. We can't grasp with our rational faculties these objective standards of truth and goodness and beauty. So God illuminates our intellects so that we can see these things. That is, we can grasp the truth of things, we can grasp the goodness of things, and the beauty of the world that God has made, and including God Himself. Now, this brings us to the way in which Augustine's metaphysics and his epistemology, his view of the nature of reality and his view of the nature of knowledge, connect to his ethics. Thinking on the truth, allowing our intellects to focus on God, brings true happiness, brings true well-being. So let's look at the three levels of knowledge for Augustine. Now, this is not too terribly different than some of the philosophers we've talked about already, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. There's sense knowledge, which is knowledge of the physical world. There's rational knowledge, knowledge from thinking and applying the mind to the senses and the content we receive. And then finally, there's contemplative knowledge. This is knowledge of God in a higher realm. That is, we can grasp the world through our senses, we can have rational knowledge, And God illuminates these things in our mind. But the purpose, the end, the goal of both sense knowledge and rational knowledge is to grasp God himself. Right? This is very much like that turning from the physical world and looking up into an eternal reality that you find in Plato's thought, especially in the allegory of the cave that we've looked at in the lecture on Plato. This is the only way to true happiness. Okay, so now let's draw back a little bit from his metaphysics and epistemology and look at Augustine's anthropology, that is, his view about what it means to be human. This is going to be a really important notion that follows from Plato, but then continues on in the Christian tradition, and will follow into even philosophers like Rene Descartes. Augustine thought that the body is just a shell. Now, this view of Augustine's also, we may contrast this with, it's more contrasting, better to contrast it with Aristotle and Aquinas. For Augustine, the body's just a shell. Now, Aristotle and Aquinas, who follow him, reject this idea. They think that the body and the soul are integrated as a unified whole. But here, Augustine kind of follows Plato, seeing the body as like a vessel. And the person, the real person, is the soul that lives in that vessel. And the soul uses the body to gain knowledge. And we gain sense knowledge by the soul's applying its power to a sensory organ. So, for example, if I can't hear or see, these are something wrong with my body and keeps my soul from being able to fully express itself and gain power. Okay. Now, when we get to when we get to Aquinas, Aquinas is going to follow Aristotle a little bit closer on this. They're both going to be what's called dualists. Augustine is a dualist about the soul. A dualist is someone who thinks there's two things that are true of human beings: a body, something physical, and something non-physical. In this case, the soul. For Augustine, though, the relation between the soul and the body is one of containment. That is, the body contains the soul. When we get to Descartes, he's going to think this as well, and Plato kind of thought something like that. Although, depending on who you read in Plato, interprets Plato, there's different views on that. Aristotle and Aquinas both maintain a kind of dualism, that is, two things true of human beings, but Aquinas is going to think, following Aristotle, that there's a tight unity between the two. That is, your body is not a container, rather that your body is an expression or a capacity of your soul. We'll get to that when we get to Aquinas, maybe, but it's a really interesting way to contrast two different forms of dualism. Both Augustine and Plato, along with Descartes, are dualists. They think there's two things true of the human being. Aquinas and Aristotle, they're both dualists. They think that there's two things true of human beings, both body and soul. They just disagree. That is Aquinas and Aristotle on the one side, Plato, Augustine, and Descartes on the other. Those two groups of dualists, they just disagree about how the body and soul are related to one another. Anyway, that's more than you might have wanted, but there it is. All right, so let's look at Augustine's view of a virtue ethic. Augustine's ethics are like Aristotle's. They are eudaimonistic. This is your word for the day. Eudaimonistic. Now, it's kind of interesting this way this word breaks down. Eu is a prefix for good. Daimon is like spirit. So Augustine's ethics are good-spirited. That is, good spirit means like well off, like euthanasia or euphemism, and daimon, spirit, or your soul. That is, the focus is on an ethic of being well off with respect to your soul. And here's kind of how this works. All of your actions have a telos, a purpose, or an end. That is, everything you do is done for a reason. And when we we act to try and achieve happiness. That is, everything we do is for the sake of happiness. But no true happiness comes apart from God and from trying to be like God. Right? That's the whole point of our happiness. And it's possible to be unhappy and not realize it. And so we settle for lesser happinesses. And you might take a look at some of C.S. Lewis's work and Kierkegaard's work, who deal with these same points. Evil, on the other hand, is a privation or a lack of the good. Now, this is a really interesting point from Augustine that's going to run all throughout Christian philosophy, even up to today. In fact, I've been working on a paper on this topic. Some Christians don't agree with it, but most do in the history of Christian philosophy. This is the idea that evil, it's not a positive reality. That is, evil is not something that exists. Like there's good on the one side and there's evil on the other, and they both exist. They're always both fighting against each other. Evil's always been around, good's always been around, and they're always at it in tension. That's not the way Augustine, I think, Christians should view the nature of evil. Rather, evil is a privation or a lack of something. Now, this is a little tricky. Hold on, let me grab a pen here. That well, I think I've got one on the shelf. Yeah, here we go. So here's a pen is attached to this book here. I'm trying to like destroy this. So this pen won't work very well. Let me see if I can get a better one. Yeah, okay. Here's one. This is kind of a small pen. So see this pen? It's a little mini pen. Now, of course, this one won't come apart either. Let me get a pen that'll come apart. Okay. Thanks for sticking with me. So here's a pen, and you want to say, is this a good pen? Well, what is a pen for, right? What's its purpose? Well, it's to write with. So the answer is, well, yeah, is this a good pen? Well, let's see. Does it write? So take my book here, open it up to the back. This is a blank page. So, and then I'll just write some things. So yes, yes. Is this a good pen? Yes, it writes, right? That's awesome. So then we ask, well, what would make this pen a bad pen? Well, suppose I took out the ballpoint part with ink, and all I had left was this thing. Now you might think, well, that's just no longer a pen. Well, it kind of looks like a pen, right? It's just lacking something. So then, now is it any good? Well, let's try it. No, no, nothing. I'm getting nothing off of this, right? I can take another blank page. I can scribble all I want. Nothing's coming out. It's blank. Why? Because it lacks something, right? So this pen, once this ink and ballpoint part has been removed, it lacks something. It's an evil pen. That's really goofy to say, but it's a bad pen, right? It's a good pen when it's whole and lacks nothing, but if it suffers a privation, it becomes a bad pen. So evil is not a positive reality on this view of evil. Evil is a lack of a good. So that if I act in a way that is evil, if I do something morally wrong, I am lacking something that I should have, right? So, for example, if, I don't know, my kids interrupt me when I'm doing something and I just scream and yell at them and cuss at them, I don't think I do this. But if I did, right, say, man, Tim's not a very good guy. That was kind of mean. That was kind of wrong. Why? Because I lacked patience. Now you might say, well, I can point to that lack of patience and call that anger or wrath or something, right? And that's fine. We can look at holes or missing things and describe them with words that almost make them seem like they have positive reality. But what we're describing is a lack, privation. So for Augustine, connecting virtue and vice together and thinking about what it means to become a good person, the actions that make us emulate or look like Jesus, like God, are virtuous because God is a perfect being. He lacks nothing. God suffers no privation. God can't be missing the thing that's essential to him, right? Namely his being. Unlike this pen. This pen can suffer a lack, right? There it goes. It's a bad pen. Now it's a good pen. God is not like that. He's a perfectly good being. But we, in our fallenness and finitude and brokenness, we are deceived into thinking that self-serving actions bring happiness, like the life that Augustine lived, right? A life of debauchery, a life of the sensual pleasure, a life of self-promotion, a life of climbing on over other people to get our way, those kinds of things. We are mistaken about that, and this leads to sin, and ultimately it leads to death. And that's the good news of Christ. And Augustine recognized that in his own life and then taught it. Let me just say something quickly about Augustine's view of politics. or maybe anthropology. This is kind of an extension of his ethics as well. He thought that the principle of morality is to love God, but the world is divided into two overlapping cities, the city of God and the city of man. The city of human beings down here, and the city of God, which is up here and down here. They overlap, right? They're mixed. Think of Jesus' teaching on the wheat and the weeds, or the tares. He calls them tares, but call them weeds. Wheat is like stuff you plant in the ground so you can eat it. It's good stuff. Weeds, or tares, these are like stuff that fall in among the seeds in your field of wheat and grow up with it. And the two are mingled, and you can't tell the difference sometimes. Where does one end and the other begin? Well, the city of God and the city of man are kind of like that. The city of God is run by God's law and is a proper society. The city of man exists due to man's need to be ruled and watched over. Christians should try and influence the city of man in every way possible. Right? In other words, we are to be in the world, but not of it. We are of a different kingdom. We are present in the world. We live in the city of man, but it's not our ultimate citizenship. In fact, if you're a Christian, you have dual citizenship. Maybe three citizenships. Try citizenship. Your country where you have your passport. You're also part of the city of this world, right? This entire world system that is a part of the material world. But you also have your citizenship in heaven, your ultimate citizenship. So the idea for Augustine is that as we live our lives in this world, we are to have an influence on the city of man, but our citizenship is ultimately in heaven. Now, a couple things about Augustine's view about the nature of reality. This kind of goes back to his metaphysics, but it's also connected with his ultimate view of the cosmos and our place in it. Augustine believed in something called creatio ex nihilo. It's a fancy Latin word for just means created out of nothing. Out of nothing. This is the idea that God, when God creates, he creates the cosmos solely from himself. In other words, God doesn't create the cosmos out of nothing. He creates out of nothing physical, nothing outside of himself. Right? He creates out of nothing. He creates something, the physical cosmos, from himself alone, not from anything else. It's probably the best way to put it. Augustine was one of the first thinkers to assert that matter is not eternal. Aristotle believed that, and the ancient Greeks as well. He said that formless matter means nothing, or means matter that is not fully formed. So God could create maybe formless matter outside of himself first and then create things. But God did not shape pre-existing matter. He spoke it into existence. It wasn't like God existed forever and there was this like matter that existed with him forever, and then he decided to shape that matter. No, on Augustine's view, God creates all material reality. I want to call that the Big Bang. I want to call it something else. Who knows what it'll be called in 1,000 years or 10,000 years from now? But all of physical reality is contingent. All of time is contingent. That means at one time it didn't exist. And Augustine, it really, really emphasizes this idea that God spoke everything into being. So there's a lot of groups that have biggest issues with this, namely the Gnostics. Gnostics were a kind of a philosophical group, or maybe not a group necessarily, there were groups of Gnostics, but kind of ways of thinking about things, which kind of eschew the fleshly and only look at the eternal. They look at the material world as something less than, but it's not. The material world is something that God created, and we as material beings, God created in our image. So just a couple things on time and eternity. At the end of the book, major work by Augustine, The Confessions, Augustine has a long discussion of this. I'm just going to mention a couple things. But the idea is that the time no longer exists beyond our memory. The future is not yet created, therefore it doesn't exist. The present is a single vanishing point that is created and immediately disappears. Eternity is an infinite nowness, and God exists in an eternal state and can see past, present, and future simultaneously. We experience the past and the future, but the only thing that's real is the now. This is kind of a view called presentism in the contemporary philosophy. It's the idea that only the present now exists. The future did exist. Sorry, the future will exist. The past did exist, but only right now exists. And God sustains all things in this immediate reality and being. So it's an interesting view of time. Time's a tough one. In fact, there's a famous line in the Confessions where Augustine says, if you don't ask me what time, I understand what time is as long as you don't ask me. And as soon as you ask me, I have no idea what time is. I've been studying time in formal classes and on my own. I still think Augustine's right about that. If you don't ask me, I kind of know what time is. But when you do ask me, I have no idea. All right, let's move on. So, wanted to say a couple words about Boethius. We've talked a little bit about, or quite a bit in this video, about Augustine. So, Boethius lives in the century following Augustine's death. He was a kind of a consul in the Roman Empire. So, after Augustine's death, the Roman Empire in Rome is lessened as a significant place in terms of the political structures of the time, because all the political and economic and cultural capital had been moved to Constantinople. Rome was still thought of as the spiritual and kind of the primacy of place city within the western part of the Roman Empire. And it got taken over by some Germanic generals in the Roman army who then took power in the city of Rome and controlled much of the Western Empire outside of Constantinople, or subservient to Constantinople. Boethius was a consul, someone who was high up in the Roman government, and during his lifetime, he tried to protect the new Roman emperor, but was accused of plotting against him, and that didn't sit well. So he was accused of something he didn't do, kind of like Socrates, put in prison, and then ultimately killed. When he was in prison, he wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which deals with how to handle suffering in this life. In other words, how do I deal with my circumstances when they change? How do I deal with my fortune? Fortune is circumstances. How do I deal with my circumstances in this changeable world? We enter the world naked and poor, and whatever good or bad things a person has comes from fortune, and it can be taken away any time. And when we die, that's the end of our fortune. It's the end of our changeable world. So it's silly to look to fortune to make us happy. Good fortune enslaves, bad fortune teaches. Happiness, according to Boethius, is temporary on the human level. And when we're anxious about it, we're miserable, right? When we think about happiness in our circumstances. So happiness can't come from stuff, can't come from things that distract us, things that are connected to fortune or change. However, since our soul is immortal, true happiness only comes from immortal things. Therefore, seeking God is seeking happiness. All right. There's a short discussion of God and time here about Boethius. He thought that God has no knowledge of the future as future, but instead is an ever-changing now. In other words, because God is above time, he can look down and see the timeline moving. He sees what's past, what's present, what's future, and he sees it simultaneously. So this still means that we have free will, but God knows our actions because they happen, not so that they will happen. We are still free on Boethius' view. God exists in an infinite nowness. So you can think of time in this way: past, present, future, and God sees both past, present, future as a now. Another option is to see God is kind of just wrapped up in time. But either ways that you think about this, God recognizes and knows all things, past, present, future, in a simultaneous now. But that doesn't limit our free will, according to Boethius. Now, if you want to read Boethius' book on this, it's called The Consolation of Philosophy. I highly, 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 highly recommend it. If you read The Consolation of Philosophy along with Augustine's Confessions, you will be more educated than almost every college student in the United States. I kid you not. I kid you not. Read them and enjoy them. I think they'll be great helps for your soul. Thanks for listening. Quick tour through Augustine and Boethius. Thanks so much, and looking forward to our next video.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.